if the feedback can have these kind of qualities, then according to Lantoff and Thorn, it can facilitate learner developmental progression from auto-regulation to self-regulation. And in the long run, they become independent learner, autonomous learner, and they can do better over time. So then in the digital age, who can provide feedback? Of course, the teacher is also is always the number one source of feedback for our learners. But beside that, we do have feedback from peers, and also the student can have their self-reflection and self-feedback to make them improve their work in the long run. And an additional part in the digital world, we have automatic feedback programs. And so Grammarly is one, criterion, which I'm going to talk about is another one. And I'm pretty sure on the list that you just shared, there are more to come with automatic feedback. So let's move on to study one, which I investigated student perceptions of synchronous computer mediated feedback using Google Docs. So here I'm going to say something about the context of this study. It is actually taking place in a content course, which is called the Writing Test for Young Language Learners. And I had 2 classes of pre-service teacher trainees in Vietnam. And during the course, I had 4 assignments, which students had to complete throughout this course. And they have to work in groups to write test items to assess young learners of English. So the research question that I aim to answer in this small study is that the overall objective was to investigate student comparative perceptions of the received feedback on their assignment via 2 different modes of feedback, which is written feedback and synchronous computer mediated feedback via Google Docs. And the specific questions that I would like to answer are, what are student comparative perception of the quantity of feedback they receive on their assignments from the 2 feedback modes? And the second question to be answered is, what are student comparative perception of the effectiveness of feedback they receive on their assignment from the 2 feedback modes? And the study design is predominantly a survey experiment with post, early, and within subject design, which means that each student experienced both modes of feedback over a period of 10 weeks. And in this course, they receive both peer and instructive feedback on their group work assignments, either in the feedback mode number 1, which indicates written feedback, where the teacher and the peer feedback were delivered via a checklist and handwritten comments on the margin of the assignment papers. And on other assignment, they will receive feedback mode number 2, which has synchronous computer mediated feedback via Google Docs, which means that the peer and the teacher annotations and comments are provided on the margins of the Google Doc, which is shared across the class. So the procedures is like this. You can look at session 5, 7, 9, and 11 of the course where students do their assignments. And so for the first, because I said earlier, there were 2 classes. And for the first class, I call class A, they will receive feedback mode number 1 for the first 2 assignments. And the feedback mode number 2, which is on Google Docs for the second assignment. And the order is reversed for class B. So in week 12 of the course, they will have a survey questionnaire to answer regarding their comparative perceptions of the 2 feedback modes using a 5-point Likert scales. And then I also target 6 students ranging in their proficiency level as well as their engagement level in the feedback sessions to interview them individually. So some findings for research question 1, as we can see here, the Wilcoxon sign rank tests were used to investigate differences in student perception of the amount of feedback they receive from their teacher and their peers. So it shows that students perceived to receive much more feedback from their teacher and their peer via the second feedback mode, which is on the Google Docs. And to supplement these findings in the quantitative analysis, I would like to have a look at this with you, where students give further comments in the interview saying why they received more feedback via the Google Doc platform. So this is a snapshot of the feedback that I've given them during the course. And then as you can see, students instantly revise their work on the side comments. In the interview, students commented that they received more feedback because they can enjoy two-way communication with the teachers during the feedback sessions. And then students also said they receive more feedback, and the cycles of feedback were iterative, because once they receive the feedback, they can instantly revise their work, and then they can do their revision, and then their revised text receive further feedback. So they have more cycle of feedback going on this kind of synchronous mediation communication platform. Also, the students also explain their perception of more feedback on Google Form or Google Docs, because they could participate more, and more students can participate in the feedback session due to the reason that we can have more people involved in the process, and they can do it somewhat simultaneously. So can you look at this one, you will see that beside the teacher feedback, student can revise, and then they have more feedback from their friends at the same time, and they know what is going on, and they can write their work more effectively. So for research question number 2, the student will ask you about the perception about the effectiveness of using the feedback in the 2 different feedback modes in terms of the way the feedback help them in making or having more collaboration with their peers and teachers, or whether the feedback help them in making more revisions, or it helps them to clearly understand and fulfill the task requirements, or help them to monitor their learning process. And across the 4 questions, students perceived to have better collaboration with their peers and teachers, as well as to make more effective revisions when they use the feedback on Google Docs compared to the traditional mode of feedback on handwritten checklist. However, for the next 2 questions regarding the effectiveness of the feedback in helping them to fulfill their task requirements better or to monitor their own learning progress, there was no difference in student perception regarding these 2 effective aspects. So to go into a little bit more quantitative data regarding how the feedback on Google Doc can help them boost collaboration among the students and the teacher. Some students said that, I think we were more confident in sharing our comments, and we were more comfortable with providing comments on the margin of the shared documents compared to even written comment on the hard copies of others' group assignments. And at the same time, they can do the comments simultaneously. So it seems that the student were very confident, and his cyber self seemed to be a bolder version of himself, where he can feel more comfortable sharing what he's saying and giving more comments to his peers. Student number 5 also said, we can give comments and observe all the comments at the same time. So it is like a mutual process where student can give comment and receiving comment, and that goes on simultaneously. So it highlights the synchronous feedback model mode as something that can facilitate not only one-to-many interaction, but also many-to-many interactions in this kind of platform. For the second point about how the feedback can aid students in making effective revisions, a few comments here from students in the interview were typical. The first one quoted here is from student number 4, and he said, the feedback is instant. And once we've read the feedback, we can immediately revise to receive further feedback on our revised text. And this is much better than the delayed written feedback on paper. Student number 3 also said that the way that the feedback is stored on Google Doc is much more accessible, because he can always refer back to it to revise his work. And it is similar to the previous one from student number 2, when the student commented that the tool allows him or her to refer to the comment at a later point in time, and to see if they can make more revisions to their work. So revision can be much more convenient if we use Google Docs, and to have it always accessible after the feedback session is withdrawn. The key point of the study is that it seems our learners' digital selves may be a bolder version of their true selves, and that explains why they tend to take on more proactive roles in a digital environment when they deliver peer feedback and also making revisions to their own work. According to some previous researchers, online collaborative tools promote learners' learning skill more effectively because they are put in a constructivist environment that aids them in making more effective revisions. And synchronous computer-mediated communication like Google Docs or Wikis, all of these kind of tools can encourage dialogic and contingent feedback, where learners can comment, edit, and revise the writing simultaneously. And so these are the perceptions of students based on based on a perception study that I did. But then feedback can be looked at more deeply by having a focus on how the student engage with the feedback. And when we look at engagement with feedback, we can kind of investigate the best way or the best practice that we can do to help our learners get most out of that kind of engagement process. And engagement here refers to learners' response to feedback they receive. And back in 2009, Alice came up with a three-dimensional framework to study learner engagement with feedback, which he divided into cognitive perspective, behavioral perspective, and affective perspective. And later authors, they further operationalized each of these dimensions as the following. I'm taking Giang and Highland in 2018. So student engagement with the feedback can be studied from a cognitive perspective, where their means their attention to the feedback. And we can investigate this using the student in utilization of cognitive and metacognitive strategies when they engage with the feedback. Engagement with the feedback can also study from a behavioral perspective, where student actions, such as revision operations, are taken into account to see how they behaviorally engage with the feedback. And effective engagement is third perspective, where we focus on student emotional and attitudinal responses to the feedback. So in the second study, I'm only focusing on student engagement with feedback, and the software that I'm looking at is Criterion, which is developed by Educational Testing Service, the ETS. For you to get some familiarization with this kind of automatic writing evaluation program, I will have the screenshot here, as you can see. If you have used Grammarly or similar programs, you will see that these kind of automatic writing evaluation program are quite similar in the way that they can instantly generate feedback to your writing using, here, the feedback can focus on organization or development, grammar, usage, mechanics, and style for this program. But for Grammarly, I think you will have some different kind of feedback also. And once you've got your feedback, you can read the feedback comments of the program, and then you can instantly revise your work, okay? So in this study, it took place in 2 intake classes of 75 Vietnamese EFL tertiary students. And this is an English for academic writing course. And the Criterion program was used as a supplementary feedback tool in this class. And 14 students were invited to take part in the Think Aloud protocol procedures when they went through revision incorporating the automatic feedback. And so in the study, the Think Aloud protocols were used to gain insight into the real-time cognitive processes when examining learners' response to the automatic feedback. You can look briefly at the procedures of the study. As I told you earlier, this is just one part of a longitudinal experimental study. And the part that I'm focusing on is the 3 practice sessions on Criterion, where students composed their essay and submitted it to Criterion, and then they do their revision to their essay using the feedback from Criterion. And throughout these 3 feedback sessions on Criterion, I invited students to take part in the Think Aloud protocols and recorded their Think Aloud for the processing of the feedback. So the only research question that I've focused on to answer was that, how do Vietnamese EFL tertiary learners engage with Criterion automated feedback? And I used the data from the recorded Think Aloud protocols of 14 students. For data analysis, we did the student recorded Think Aloud protocol were coded for engagement episodes. And so in the Think Aloud, each identified engagement episode were coded for the level of engagement. And I used Stott and Wiggles was 2010 definitions of what limited and extensive engagement is, depending on the student utilization of cognitive, metacognitive, or revision strategy when processing the feedback. So some findings regarding student engagement with the feedback. So you can see here, we had a total of 270 engagement episodes demonstrated in student Think Aloud protocols. And 2/3 of all the engagement episodes were limited engagement, where students have quite superficial engagement with feedback, where they use such as error tags as a trigger for self-editing, and they don't need to go further into reading the error message from criterion, or they can just simply skip the error after they read the feedback, or just simply guess the correct form. So these accounted for about 2/3 of all the engagement episode recorded. On the other 1/3 of the engagement episode, students demonstrated extensive engagement with the feedback. By going very, to some extent, to look up, for example, they look up online resources, also draw on stored meta-linguistic knowledge that they have learned before, and then they can process the feedback and respond to the tagged error. They can also get cues from criterion error messages and trying to figure out what is wrong with their message, what is wrong with their writing, and then they revise. They also resort to translating it into L1 as a way of dealing with the error that they are trying to respond to. And consulting a peer teacher is another one that they did during the time they revised their error. So basically, we can see that students are engaged with the feedback to some extent, but at different levels of engagement. So this is an example engagement episode that I'm starting for you to see from criterion. And here's the student text. So in this case, criterion feedback was a false positive or false alarm because it incorrectly tagged an error as erratic, but actually it's something they have, the student have done well. So the criterion said that the student should replace the adjective your, with you are for the short form, and this is a false alarm. And in response to this feedback, the students verbalize in the think aloud. The students say, I don't think I need to change this word because your is an adjective, earning power is a noun, and your is a possessive. So I don't think I need to change this word. So in this case, you can see that the student didn't take the feedback as is, but he tried to evaluate if the feedback is correct. And then after some searching for meta-linguistic knowledge, the student decided not to change. So I particularly look at the engagement with the incorrect feedback from students. And so it turned out that students usually had extensive engagement with incorrect feedback. And their most popular strategy to deal with the incorrect feedback that they received from the system were reflecting on their stored meta-linguistic knowledge to find a solution to their tagged error. And luckily, most frequent response to false positive from the system were no revision, which is a justified decision from the students. So the study goes to show that students engage with all the received feedback to an extent, and they particularly process incorrect code and false positive using extensive engagement strategies. And also through that, we can see students can exercise some self-regulatory strategies to make justified decisions during the revision process. If we look at student engagement in more depth, we will see that in an we can help students to transition from a structured learning environment into an autonomous learning environment. For example, if we look back at the Google study, we will see that the teacher and the peers deliver feedback via a synchronous collaborative tool, which is Google Doc. And in this case, the students receive the feedback and they can interact with the peer. But then on their revisions, help them in the long run to transition from other regulation to self-regulation. Totally lacks the quality of being, graduated or contingent or dialogic. The student basically work on their own, trying to self-monitor their own revision process and make their own decision most of the time. But although it lacks all this kind of quality of being effective feedback, as we have in the previous study, but students have learned to mediate their own engagement with external feedback using self-regulatory learning strategies, including things like They evaluate the quality of the feedback, they monitor their own revising process, and they utilize other appropriate revision or cognitive strategies. So with that, I think we need to reconceptualize what makes effective feedback in the digital world. As I said earlier, from a social cultural perspective, formative feedback should be graduated, it should be contingent, and it should be dialogic. But it seems like in the digital world, we have to look at the other two qualities that digital affordances have allowed us to synchronous feedback generation platform. These 5 qualities, I believe, if we can do that well, we can help students transition from someone who depends on others for their revision and for their progress into someone who is more autonomous and who are skillful at using self-regulatory strategy in monitoring their own learning process. And with that, I would like to have some concluding notes here. I believe that there's one size fits all form of e-feedback. Earlier sharing you have on Menti, there are so many tools out there you've used, and you will see that each of the tools you've used will do best at one kind of feedback for your students. So the best approach here is to use a combination of several digital tools for formative feedback in EFL classrooms. And I would like to cite an author at the turn of the century, Blake, 2001, and which is 20 years ago. He said that while it is unlikely for any technology to replace a human teacher, teachers who use technology could probably replace the teachers who did not use it. And it seems like we have no choice now, rather than transitioning to make our teaching for our students. And with that, I would like to leave you with some points to ponder if you would like to carry on the discussion in the Q&A. So I'm still asking myself, and maybe you are asking yourself, that how we as teachers, how are our roles transformed in the technology-enhanced feedback modalities? How can we reshape that and make it work for our students and benefits them to the best? And can we make feedback literacy become part of our teaching agenda? Meaning, how can we have our students become more feedback literate people who can make use of the feedback to the most and monitor their own learning and monitor their own progress and get better over time? So some points for you if you want to carry on into the discussion. And that brings me to the end of my talk now. And thank you so much for your listening. Okay.
Thank you so much. So now we have yes, it's probably about 20 minutes. So if you have any questions, if you could send it to chat, and Min, my colleague as here, he's going to collect and ask questions. And also if you have any comment in response to Hoang's questions, that would be great as well too. Thank you.
Okay. I think if you have some reflections on your personal use of digital tools in your own classroom, it's time to share and talk about maybe the pros and cons and how you feel you are trying to reconceptualize your own roles as a teacher in that environment. How does your role have changed from the traditional mode into the digital mode?
Hoang, could you just show your questions as well too?
Yeah. Questions right away. I can have another question.
So we have a question from Sue to Dr. Giang. What is your opinion about which is the most effective digital feedback tool?
Okay.
So Dr. Giang, Hoang, are you clear about the question? Yeah, so Sue is asking.
So yeah, I think, yeah, can you still hear me? The connection is
Yes,
a little bit
perfectly.
unstable.
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
From time to time, it's just the breaks, but it's fine.
All right. So I guess the question is from Sue. What is your opinion about which is the most effective digital feedback tool? As I said earlier, there is no feedback tool that works for all situations. And that means that we have to have a combination between different feedback tools for different purposes. And that will help us to address different different factors, because sometimes we need feedback which is direct, explicit. Sometimes we need feedback that is like a mutual communication between parents on your teaching situation and your students as well, where you have to decide on which form to use. And in the end, I think the best kind of feedback is it is not good or bad in itself. It is how we as teacher use it to the purpose that we need to address that makes it is the best tool that benefit our learners. So yeah, that is my response to Sue's question. And that is the reason why I've used multiple digital tools for different classes.
Thank you for your response. And now we have two very related questions from Joe Hancock and Ferry Kilikaya. So they're asking about the time it takes to, do synchronous feedback for a large class. So what, in your opinion, what are some effective strategies to provide synchronous feedback in a large class?
Yes, my students, usually I teach large classes. And when I talk about large classes, it is about 30 or more students. That's what I mean. And using Google Docs is one way that I think can help me address that large number. I teach courses and also some course assignments of exercises to do. They can share their work on the shared document, and that way they can have their feedback, peer and teacher feedback at the same time, synchronously on that same file, and others look at that and look at each other. And sometimes if there's a limit on time, I would just kind of give feedback on one sample, and then student can refer back to that as their own work. So that saves quite a lot of time for me as a teacher. But there is one issue about that, where you have the face-threatening situation where some students are not willing to share their work on a shared document. So in this case, if they do need more personal guidance, I think I ask them, or I encourage them to send me some kind of further notes via some personal channel. And that helps me address more individual learners. Story about
I wonder whether, Giang, could you just stop sharing? It might help your connection.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for your response.
The connection is not that.
Yes, I hope it's better now. So another question, and this time on a more research side. So participant would like to know more about the think aloud process that you use in your study. I'm not quite sure what study she refers to, but I guess you're more clearer about that. Yeah. So anyway, some more information about think aloud protocol.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it takes some reading, but I'm sorry. I'm kind of frustrated when I see Naomi here. I don't know how she got the information. Maybe she has a better answer than me. Okay. Hello, Naomi. Nice to see you. It's like when you ask it down, and as they walk through some kind of cognitive duty, like when they're revising their texts using the feedback, they will sit down, and normally they will sit down and work silently. But with some training, you can ask them to verbalize what they're thinking as they walk along. So it's like speaking out your thoughts in this case. And yeah, I can send you some reference for the reading where you can learn the way to do the think aloud process. Later on, Miss Yu, yeah, I think, no. So I don't know, yeah, but you can
That's actually
have a
Miss
reading
Quinton,
on
right?
yeah, I'm not sure who's that Quinton. Yes.
The
So
question from Quinton.
so you have process. Okay.
Thank you. And now another question, and this time it's a very interesting question regarding the provision of feedback for students with lower proficiency levels. So the question is from Ms. Hoang is there any limit or restriction in applying the digital feedback to students whose proficiency levels are not quite high?
Okay. I stress the fact that it is not about the digital tool itself. It's about how we use it. For example, we go back to Google Doc, or you can have student writing, and if you deliver explicit feedback, it may be better for your student who are of lower proficiency levels. But when you have more proficient learners, you can deliver feedback in a more implicit way. You give them guidance. You point out that there's something wrong here, but you don't explicitly say what you need to do to revise it. So for that, I mean, it much depends on how we use the tools. It's not about the tool itself would decide whether it is effective for the learners or not. Okay, the kind of feedback is still mediated. It's still decided by the teacher and the peers. And the exception to this rule is the automatic feedback that I just shared earlier, because when we talk about the automatic feedback, it has been pre-programmed to do the job of giving feedback. Most of the time, it will be very explicit, and that is not in this case. But then this kind of tool can be good for lower proficiency learners. So it offers very explicit feedback. It shows you the way to correct the error, for example. So yeah, that would be my response. It again depends on the way you use your feedback and deliver it via digital tools.
Thank you. I guess it has to do with the notion of the feedback should be graduated and contingent, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. So another question this time is about from boy Giang from UQ. She's wondering about the strategies to encourage students to speak while they write. Because in her study, she used collaborative writing tasks for data collection, and her participants did not talk quite actively.
Okay. So I believe that when I first trialed the think aloud procedures with my students, they were not very confident, and some of them were not familiar with this kind of procedures. So all take some training. For my personal story, I sit down with them and I demonstrated the way to do the think aloud with them, and then after the first time, some of them failed. So I had to reject it on this kind of data. And then I went back to them and give them a good example of another student who did very well during Think Aloud, and give them another chance to look at that as a demonstration. And they did have time to do that on their own. And when they're more comfortable with this kind of procedure, they could do it better. And I think it much depends. And there is always some kind of problem with using the kind of verbal protocol, because it interferes with the cognitive process of the student in some sense. And it's very hard to get the best data that we can have, but we tried to make it work to the most effective way. And I think training, again, is the key. For what you have put up here regarding collaborative writing, for this one, I think there's an expert here who can have some advice. And I would like to hand that over to Naomi, because she did collaborative writing and she did collect data on that. So if you want to share some points on that, that would be wonderful, Naomi.
Okay, thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt. For those of you doing collaborative writing, as Giang said, you also need training, and there's lots of factors which impact on whether students will talk to each other, including the type of task, their proficiency level, their motivation. So lots of factors impact on learners' willingness to communicate, to collaborate and speak to each other. But yeah, training is very important, and practice.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you, Naomi. That's great to hear from you. And yeah, it seems to freeze a little bit from my side. Okay. I see a question from Tâm talking about the false alarms on the automatic feedback. Okay, so that is why I think I mentioned feedback literacy at the beginning, towards the end of the talk. Feedback literacy means that we have to kind of prepare our students for how to deal with the feedback and how to respond and incorporate the feedback in the most profitable way to them. And one of the even false alarm or incorrect feedback from automatic systems can help them to practice their self-regulatory skills in making their own decision. So as teacher, I think we have to make students become feedback literate people by training them how to respond, how to give feedback to other people, and then how to evaluate their own performance in giving feedback and in evaluating the feedback when they are using it. So this is why we said using feedback and formative feedback is not only about their own academic field. It also encourages them to develop self-regulation and make them become more independent and autonomous learners. So yeah, it is a fact that now we have a lot of false
All right.
okay.
All right. So you went away for a short while. Anyway, thank you for your response. And so that actually very closely related
Yeah, I'm
to
sorry
Maria's
now,
question.
and back in. So I lost access to the question now, Min.
Yeah. So actually, Maria asked you a very related question, to your previous response. She asked that did your students seem to improve in their self-regulation and metacognitive awareness thanks to the Think Aloud protocol? Or did you not measure this in your study?
Jiang?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
All right,
So,
you're back.
Sorry for my connection. It's very terrible this morning. Okay.
I guess I should repeat the question, right? So I just talk about Maria's question, which is related to previous response. She asked that whether the students improve in their metacognition and the self-regulation thanks to the Think Aloud protocol. And if you measure this in any way, or did you just like kind of not pay much attention to that in your study?
Okay, great question. But that will mean that I have to shift the focus of my study from learning about the to learning about how my research data collection tool impacts the progression of my learners. So that would be a different study if I want to look at that.
I wonder what, oh. Hi, John. So probably might be good to switch off your camera, even if you would love to see your face, but might be better.
Yeah, I don't know. It just dropped me out of the meeting. So
Yes, I guess I hope it has nothing to do with Maria's question. Anyway, let's move on to a different question and see if we'll have better luck. So this one from Fran at UQ, I guess. So she's wondering how can you convince your students that automated feedback is good for them? Because in her experience, some adult learners, they just refuse to receive feedback from machine and they prefer like human feedback.
great response from the teacher, because a lot of previous studies have shown that feedback on like I said, form feedback from automatic writing programs like Criterion or Grammarly are pretty good, meaning their accuracy level can be 80% plus. They do have false alarm, they do have false positive on student feedback, but on student writing, but to some extent, for very superficial level errors, they do a great job. And our task as a teacher, and I myself, also in my writing classes, I always caution students about some positive that the system may have. But it is much better to have a tool there for you to do the proofreading for you, instead of waiting for the delayed feedback from the teacher who have to quite large classes, and the feedback is quite my students to make use of the feedback and try to tell them you have to double check if you are unsure about something. And that is my approach. I don't know if the story works in, I don't know the name of the person who put the question, but hopefully that will work, because a lot of research have done to prove that the feedback from automatic writing programs are satisfactory. Usually they're above 80% accurate and precise. Okay.
Thank you. And another question from Ngọc Lan is very interesting one, also the more research side of your project. She's asking about, have you compared the writing result of final exams of students who have more interaction or writing feedback on digital tools and the ones who have less? And basically a question about the efficacy of the digital feedback.
Yeah, my study on Google Docs were actually within subject design. So in this case, the students were able to access and experience both forms of feedback. So I didn't design it to be a comparative study where you have the experiment on one control group and the other one on an experimental group. So it's hard to gauge their or to compare their different outcomes towards the end of the course. But in the other study about automatic feedback, I did have an experimental design, and I did conduct, some quantity studies to compare their pre-test and the post and delayed post-test. And sadly, there was no statistically difference in their delayed post-test, which shows that the system doesn't seem to have students to improve in terms of accuracy. But at least they do have engagement with the feedback, and they do have some self-regulatory strategies to handle their revisions during the time they process the feedback. So yeah, that's my answer.
Right, thank you so much. And I think I should draw your attention to a very thoughtful comment from Professor Naomi Storch. So she suggests that we should train our students to become critical consumers of these programs. It's very well said. Thank you, Professor Storch.
Okay, great.
Anyway, thank you so much for John and also everyone. It is, and also now I see there are a lot of familiar faces. I someone who might have been in the UQ with us, so that is really great, and including, of course, Naomi. So then just to finish off, I just let you know what's happening next from